When a sealed envelope marked for official eyes only was opened behind locked palace doors, no one expected it to ignite a firestorm that would leave Princess Anne reeling. Hidden for years in a vault beneath Windsor, the document bore the final signature of Prince Philip, and it contained a name that sent tremors through the monarchy: Prince Louis. The youngest child of Prince William and Princess Catherine, barely visible on the public stage, had just been handed a legacy that many assumed would be passed to someone else. Someone who had walked beside Prince Philip in duty, in silence, and in service his only daughter, Princess Anne. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The revelation did not come with ceremony or fanfare. It came in a hushed room, under dim lighting, with only a handful of trusted aides and senior royals present. Prince Charles, now king, had quietly authorized the unsealing of Philip's private will, stored beneath Windsor's oldest wing in a temperature-controlled vault. What was expected to be a formal review of financial arrangements turned into something far more explosive. The entire room reportedly froze as the name Louis Arthur Charles appeared in ink, accompanied by a directive from Philip himself that the personal estate properties, rare artifacts, and undisclosed investments be transferred entirely to his great-grandson. The tension was immediate, and the silence afterward was not of respect but of disbelief. What rattled many within the palace wasn't just the decision itself, but how it was made. Neither Princess Anne nor Prince Edward had been consulted before the unsealing. Royal protocol, often revered with obsessive precision, had been bypassed. The absence of transparency only fueled suspicion. Philip's estate was his final mark upon the legacy he spent decades shaping, and in one stroke he had excluded the daughter who had walked in his shadow for over half a century. Those present described Anne's face as unreadable at first, but as the initial shock passed, a faint quiver in her jaw betrayed something deeper: grief disguised as fury. This wasn't about titles or wealth. It was about meaning, about recognition, about betrayal. Attached to the will was a handwritten note from Philip, addressed not to Anne but to the future of duty, unshaped by tradition's burden. It was widely interpreted as a nod to Louis, the blank slate, the royal untouched by scandal or expectation. Some in the room saw this as poetic, others saw it as a brutal erasure. "Anne," they whispered, stared at the floor for several minutes before rising and leaving the room in silence, never looking back. The room remained frozen even after she left, as if something sacred had been broken. Senior aides kept the matter quiet, desperate to control what they knew could spiral into a family fracture. But the damage was already done. Behind the scenes, conversations shifted, sides were drawn, and within those ancient palace walls, something invisible cracked. Because this wasn't just a decision, it was a declaration. A shift in royal dynamics that positioned the youngest over the eldest. And that wound would soon cut deeper than anyone could imagine. But if the letter was a blow, what followed in the Queen's private sitting room would destroy the last thread of trust Anne held for her father's legacy. Behind closed doors, Princess Anne, the stoic royal known for never shedding tears, collapsed into a silence so heavy it unsettled even her closest staff. Her words were few, but laced with pain. "He erased me." What had been an unshakable bond between father and daughter now lay in ruins, buried under the weight of one final betrayal. The corridors of Buckingham Palace, which once echoed with her confident stride, now felt like chambers of grief. For decades, Anne had been the embodiment of duty, the steel spine of a monarchy constantly tested by scandal, exile, and internal decay. But in a single moment, with a single document, everything she believed about her place in the royal order was torn from her. Anne vanished from the public eye for 72 hours. Her scheduled engagements, a veterans' charity, a Commonwealth Council, and a military ceremony were all quietly postponed. The official statement cited exhaustion, but inside palace walls, the truth was far more raw. Those closest to her, the staff who had watched her endure loss, criticism, and political cold shoulders, said they had never seen her like this. One lady-in-waiting reportedly broke down in tears after finding Anne staring wordlessly at a portrait of her and Philip taken aboard the Britannia decades ago. It was a silence, not of mourning, but of disbelief, of emotional exile. What stung the most was not just being passed over, it was being dismissed. For all the royal children, Anne had been the one most like Philip, stern, loyal, intolerant of nonsense. While others wavered, she stood firm. She never sought headlines, never strayed from duty, never craved power. She represented the monarchy at its most unshakable, and yet, the very man who had moulded her into that unyielding figure had, in the end, handed his legacy to a child too young to understand the storm now gathering around him. The question that began to torment her was not just why, but how long had he planned it? Whispers began to circulate. Was Philip disappointed in her? Had she failed some hidden expectation? Or had he simply decided that the future belonged to innocence, not experience? These were questions no royal protocol could answer, and they began to gnaw at Anne's certainty, unearthing years of quiet sacrifices made in the shadows. She had watched Charles ascend, watched Andrew fall, watched Edward fade into background. Through it all, she never wavered. She served, without ever asking for acknowledgement. Now that absence of entitlement felt like a curse. Her humility had cost her a seat at her father's final table. In a rare act of emotional honesty, Anne sought out Charles. The meeting took place in Clarence House, private, tense, and utterly devastating. Palace sources say their conversation lasted less than 20 minutes. Charles, newly crowned and bearing the weight of transition, had hoped for understanding, but what he received instead was a whisper from Anne that would reportedly haunt him: "He made me invisible." It was not a demand, it was a eulogy. A farewell, not to a father, but to an identity she thought was hers. His confidant, his equal, his legacy bearer. That night, Anne returned to her quarters and ordered that no more floral arrangements be sent in Philip's name. "What are they mourning?" she reportedly asked. "Because I don't recognize the man they're celebrating." That single sentence rippled through the palace like a silent bomb. It wasn't rebellion. It was grief turned into cold, calculated withdrawal, a royal detachment that spoke louder than any public statement ever could. Those who understood Anne's heart knew the damage wasn't temporary. This wound wasn't going to fade with time. It had carved itself into the very structure of the monarchy's foundation. And yet, the palace had only just begun to unravel because the public wasn't supposed to know, until someone decided it was time to leak everything. Within 48 hours of the sealed will's unveiling, a major tabloid splashed the headline across its front page: "Prince Louis inherits Philip's empire." The leak was deliberate, the timing surgical, and someone inside the palace had made a dangerous move. Who broke the code of silence, and why now? The story, once confined to whispers behind velvet drapes, exploded into the global spotlight with a force no one could contain. The royal press office was caught utterly off guard. Phone lines rang off the hook, headlines multiplied, and media vans lined up outside the palace gates like vultures drawn to the scent of blood. This wasn't just a story. It was an ambush. Inside the palace, shock turned to fury. The will had been reviewed by only 5 individuals, all trusted, all sworn to silence, yet someone had bypassed centuries of royal discretion and chosen chaos. Initial speculation pointed to an administrative error, but the tone of the leak, the timing, the specific phrases used revealed something far more sinister. This wasn't the work of an outsider, it was an inside job, and it was surgical in its precision. One senior official, requesting anonymity, said the language used in the article sounded like it came from someone who was in the room when the will was unsealed. That narrowed the list, and with every hour, suspicion mounted. Theories spiraled rapidly. Whispers of a disgruntled aide closely tied to Princess Anne surfaced almost immediately. A long-time staffer, loyal, overlooked, and recently reassigned, was said to have taken Philip's final slight against Anne personally. Palace insiders claimed she had been heard venting about Anne being treated like a spare when she was the spine. Others looked further afield. A former security officer with known ties to Zara Tindall had been quietly dismissed months prior. Foe. Lowing an unrelated breach. But now, his name was being mentioned again, this time with alarming consistency. Was this about revenge? Or was it about justice? The leak did something far more damaging than media chaos. It forced King Charles into a corner, with the public demanding answers and the Queen consort urging swift containment. Charles was left with no choice. He called an emergency meeting of the senior royals. Attendees included William, Catherine, Anne, and Edward, but notably absent were Harry and Meghan. Their silence spoke volumes. The Sussex's team issued no statement, no denial, and no sympathy, just radio silence. Theories ignited once again. Had someone from Montecito used the moment to escalate internal tensions? Was this a carefully timed reminder that even across the ocean, they still held cards that could flip the royal deck? Inside the palace, paranoia tightened its grip. Devices were checked, internal communications were frozen, and interviews were quietly conducted with those closest to the estate review. But no definitive source could be identified. Everyone suspected, no one confessed. And as the press hounded every entrance, what should have been a moment of quiet mourning for Philip was now a battlefield of power plays, generational resentment, and silent accusations. What made it worse was the fact that the public was now involved, riled up, emotionally invested, and overwhelmingly sympathetic to Anne. The monarchy's internal wound was now a public spectacle, bleeding for the world to see. With the public watching and the press circling like vultures, the spotlight turned to the most unexpected heir, an innocent child caught in a crossfire of AC and resentment. He was the youngest, the quietest, the least visible of William and Catherine's children. And yet Prince Louis, barely aware of the crown's weight, had forged a private connection with his great-grandfather that no one saw coming. Until now. Until everything changed. As the palace reeled from the leak and the public demanded answers, focus shifted from royal chaos to the unlikeliest name at the center of it all. Louis had never asked for the spotlight, but it found him, wrapped in legacy, shadowed by grief, and burdened by a choice he never made. And as details emerged of his quiet bond with Prince Philip, the story took a turn no one could have predicted. This wasn't about favoritism. This was about something deeper, something Philip may have seen that others had long overlooked. Within the thick hedges of Windsor private gardens where protocol melted into peace, the young prince and the aging Duke of Edinburgh found each other in simplicity. Aides recalled moments where Louis, curious and unfiltered, would pepper Philip with questions about everything: his medals, his ships, his stories from battlefields far away. What began as innocent curiosity evolved into something rare: trust. Philip, known for his stern reserve, reportedly softened around Louis in a way even family members hadn't witnessed in years. He would call him a lion with a poet's heart, an unusual phrase that those close to him later said embodied Louis's rare blend of boldness and sensitivity. And then came the letters, handwritten, exchanged over months, even during Philip's final days. Some, according to insiders, included riddles, historical references, and subtle metaphors. It wasn't just a grandfatherly affection, it was a dialogue, cryptic and emotional, between generations separated by age but bound by a shared spirit. It was said that Philip once confided in an aide, "He listens without needing to impress." That's rarer than you think. The implications of this quiet affection began to explain what had previously seemed unexplainable. Louis hadn't inherited the estate simply because of lineage. He had inherited something Philip believed had nearly disappeared from the royal bloodline: clarity. Catherine, always composed but fiercely protective, had also played a role Philip deeply respected. Her maternal influence, calm, intelligent, unwavering, had shaped Louis into the kind of royal Philip hoped the future would be. Not hardened by entitlement, but sharpened by curiosity and grace. That influence did not go unnoticed. In his final years, Philip reportedly remarked that Catherine was raising her children with the spine of a monarch and the soul of a citizen. It was the highest compliment he could give. And in Louis, he saw the result of that upbringing, a boy untouched by the feuds and scandals that plagued the others. A blank canvas with a sense of history in his bones. Still, not everyone accepted the sentiment. Some began drawing comparisons between Louis and Anne, not to diminish either, but to question whether the same qualities Philip once admired in his daughter had now been reborn in his great-grandson. Was this inheritance a way to correct something he believed had been lost? Had Philip seen, in Louis, the mirror of a younger Anne before duty hardened her, before tradition constrained her, before the crown's cold expectations bent her spirit into silence? If that was the case, then the inheritance wasn't just symbolic, it was a message. But admiration alone doesn't justify a royal upheaval, and for Anne, the estate wasn't about wealth, it was about recognition, which is why she decided to fight back. She rarely speaks to the press, she never complains, but this time Princess Anne made an exception. In a carefully worded royal statement, she didn't name names, but the undertone was unmistakable. This was war, and the public felt every syllable. It wasn't posted with a televised address or broadcast through the BBC. It appeared quietly, almost too quietly, on the official royal.uk website, tucked beneath the Royal Engagements tab on her personal page. But for those who read it, and those who understood the palace's subtle language of veiled truths, the message was deafening, a declaration not of rebellion, but of reckoning. The statement was brief, less than 200 words, but every line dripped with layered intent. Anne spoke of sacrifice, of forgotten legacies, of duty rendered invisible by modern optics and palace convenience. Most notably, she wrote, "History cannot be rewritten by the silence of those too comfortable to remember who carried the weight before them." It was the kind of phrasing that only the hardened, wounded, and unyielding could summon. Analysts immediately recognized it for what it was, not a grievance, but a warning. This was no ordinary disappointment. It was a challenge to the institution itself, from one of its most unshakable pillars. Almost instantly, the world took notice. Screenshots of the statement spread like wildfire across social media. Within hours, #Justice for Anne B. Egan trending globally. Commentators, royal watchers, and even former aides chimed in with veiled affirmations. Some called it the most loaded royal message since Diana's panorama. Others said it was the first time since Queen Elizabeth's reign that a senior royal had issued such a bold, personalized rebuke, one that pierced through palace protocol like a blade through velvet. Support poured in from across the Commonwealth, former servicemen, equestrians, and lifelong royalists, now rallying behind the so-called forgotten Queen of Duty. Inside the palace, the temperature shifted. Catherine's camp, long regarded as composed and cautious, was reportedly caught off guard. Sources close to her admitted privately they had not anticipated Anne would take her grief public, much less weaponize it with such precision. There were whispers of crisis meetings behind Kensington's gates, an urgent review of public relations strategy, and a growing anxiety that the Crown's internal fractures were no longer private. Even allies of William, usually shielded by public goodwill, grew nervous. If Anne was willing to go this far, what came next could be seismic. But perhaps the most telling silence came from King Charles. No acknowledgement, no clarification, no attempt to douse the flame Anne had just lit. Those close to him described his mood as muted but troubled. For a monarch seeking to preserve unity in a fragile moment, Anne's statement represented a splinter that could no longer be ignored. Her words had escaped the palace gates, and the people were listening, loudly. What had begun as a quiet internal grievance had become a public reckoning with legacy, gender, and generational betrayal. And as public sympathy swayed toward Anne, the palace scrambled to justify Philip's final act, digging into a past no one wanted revisited. Buried within the legal jargon of Philip's will was a clause so carefully worded it stunned royal attorneys. It wasn't just a transfer of wealth, it was a message, a warning, a final chess move in a game no one realized was still being played. While most had been distracted by the headline, the outright handover of Philip's estate to young Prince Louis, those who studied the fine print uncovered a clause that changed the entire landscape. It stated that the inheritance could not be altered, amended, or redistributed under royal influence or sovereign reinterpretation, a phrasing so rare, so specific, that even seasoned royal legal teams were caught off guard. In one line, Philip had not only protected his choice, but preemptively blocked any attempt by the reigning monarch or council to override it. The clause was more than legal armor, it was a statement of intent. One section referenced the preservation of legacy through eyes unclouded by court tradition, a poetic yet piercing rebuke to the very institution Philip had served for decades. Analysts quickly suggested this wasn't about property, it was about philosophy, it was about safeguarding what he believed was a dying principle honor, untethered from hierarchy. And by placing it in the hands of Prince Louis, Philip was bypassing the machinery of rank and reaching for something uncorrupted, unprogrammed. This wasn't a will. It was a manifesto, cloaked in legal protection. The shock deepened as historians dug through royal archives and found chilling parallels. The language bore resemblance to a clause written during Queen Victoria's reign, when a lesser-known cousin was granted authority over a disputed estate to prevent political manipulation. In that case, too, the inheritance had bypassed the expected heir in favor of one deemed morally neutral. Was Philip invoking a royal precedent known only to the most elite inner circle? If so, then this clause wasn't haphazard. It was historic. And it had been embedded like a secret detonator, waiting for the right moment to explode. Some insiders believed this was Philip's final judgment on the state of the monarchy, a subtle but devastating rebuke of Charles's tightening grip and Anne's unwavering allegiance to tradition. Others argued it was more personal, a last act of agency from a man who had spent most of his life 2 steps behind the crown. By leaving his estate to Louis and protecting that act with legal steel, Philip had redefined succession not by title, but by trust. He had chosen youth over age, clarity over calculation. And he had done it in such a way that no one could undo it without tearing at the very fabric of royal law. Within the palace, debates raged in hushed tones. Was this betrayal or brilliance? Some staff whispered that Philip had simply grown tired of the old guard, tired of seeing history recycle itself through familiar faces and forgotten lessons. Others said it was an emotional decision, born of a final burst of defiance from a man who had spent too long in the background. Whatever the motive, the result was the same. The royal order had been scrambled, and no amount of ceremonial calm could put the pieces back the way they were. But as the palace dissected legal phrasing, Anne's next move shocked everyone because she wasn't done. She had her own legacy to reclaim. While the palace obsessed over Philip's estate, Anne was negotiating behind the scenes. With quiet resolve and steely grace, she brokered a counter-deal that stunned the royals and proved she would not be erased from history without a fight. Far from the cameras and away from the legal battles brewing in London, Anne turned her attention northward to Scotland, to legacy, and to the place where her father's soul had always felt most free. It was there, nestled in the remote highlands, that Philip had once accepted custodianship over a naval-linked estate gifted in honor of his military service. The land, though symbolic, held history personal, royal, and strategic, and Anne, with the precision of someone who knew exactly what was being stolen from her, moved to claim it not through inheritance, but through preservation. Her negotiations were discreet. She approached the Scottish trustees not with entitlement, but with conviction. Her case wasn't about wealth, it was about memory, about honouring the maritime roots that had defined Philip long before the crown had shackled his identity. And it worked. Through a private legal arrangement, Anne secured custodianship over the estate, with one condition etched into the statement of transfer, that the property would be used to preserve naval history, leadership values, and Philip's unfiltered philosophies unbound by court approval or ceremonial oversight. A statement of intent was quietly filed, in Anne's own hand, declaring to uphold the legacy through action, not inheritance. It wasn't just a message, it was a mission, and it rang low, "Euder than any crown decree." Prince Edward, ever the quiet ally, was said to have assisted in navigating the complex legalities, leveraging his own ties with Scottish legal networks and estate advisors. Though he remained in the background, his presence gave Anne the final boost of leverage she needed. Together they sidestepped the central royal machine and created a legacy of their own. And when the public found out, everything changed. Media outlets that had once portrayed Anne as the sidelined royal began rewriting the narrative. Op-eds praised her for dignity under fire. Historians called it a strategic reclamation of Philip's soul. And social media? It exploded again, but this time not in outrage, but in admiration. The quiet brilliance of Anne's move lay in its irony. While the crown wrestled over titles, wills, and the symbolism of a young heir, Anne anchored her father's spirit in stone, land, and legacy. She didn't need the estate to prove her worth, she became its living extension. As one former palace historian put it, Anne didn't lose the inheritance. She became it, and in doing so she reframed the entire conversation. No longer the overlooked daughter, no longer the silent soldier, but the royal who acted when others simply inherited. The ripple effect was immediate. Public sentiment began to tilt. Coverage that had once centered on Louis's surprise elevation began to explore Anne's defiant response. Comparisons shifted from age to action, from generational hope to generational strength. What Philip left behind in material form now felt like a shadow of what Anne had recaptured in meaning. Her legacy wasn't signed into a will. It was forged, strategically, by her own hand beyond palace walls but within the royal soul. But no royal story ends without confrontation, and when Anne came face to face with Catherine and William, the atmosphere turned icy. 3 futures, 1 shattered legacy. In a room heavy with portraits and silence, Princess Anne faced William and Catherine not as aunt and nephew, but as rivals bound by blood and betrayal. What followed was not shouting, but something far more chilling. The meeting, unscheduled and unrecorded, took place within the inner chambers of Windsor Castle. No aides, no advisors, just 3 royals tethered to the same lineage, now standing at opposing ends of a generational divide. The air was tense with restrained fury, not loud but suffocating, the kind of stillness that preceded a storm, and in this case, the storm had already passed. They were standing in its aftermath, surrounded by debris that couldn't be cleared. Anne broke the silence first. Her voice was even, but every syllable cut like ice. "Do you believe he was right?" she asked William, her eyes never leaving his. It wasn't an accusation. It was a demand for truth, one that William hesitated to answer but only briefly. When he did speak, it was with the kind of certainty that either comes from youthful idealism or inherited conviction. "He saw further than all of us," William said, measured but unapologetic. "He made a choice for the future, not the past." The words landed like a slap, not because they were cruel, but because they confirmed Anne's deepest fear, that Philip had not just overlooked her, but deliberately chosen to cast her legacy aside. Catherine said nothing. She stood by William, hands folded, gaze lowered. Her silence was thunderous. Anne watched her, waiting, daring her to offer even a single word of dissent or sympathy. But none came. That quiet neutrality, whether born of loyalty or fear, was interpreted as something far worse, consent. In that moment, Anne wasn't just confronting the loss of an inheritance, she was confronting the burial of her father's memory in favor of a future she no longer recognized. She turned away, but only for a second, long enough for her eyes to fall upon a nearby portrait of Philip, one taken during his early naval days. She stared at it, lips trembling slightly, then whispered, "He wouldn't have survived this palace now. It wasn't said for their benefit. It was a requiem, soft and final. No resolution followed, no apologies, no extended hands, only the low hum of unspoken wounds that would never fully close." Anne left first, her footsteps echoing through the empty corridors like a royal ghost retreating from a throne that had never welcomed her. William remained standing. Catherine glanced toward the door but still said nothing. In that cold and royal room, 3 generations of monarchy had collided, and no one emerged untouched. It wasn't a family meeting. It was a reckoning cloaked in civility. The palace never acknowledged the encounter. No one spoke of it. But something changed in the days that followed. The public, sensing the fracture, began asking harder questions. Media outlets cautiously referenced growing tensions behind Windsor's walls. And among staff, rumours swirled that Anne had made a private vow, one that had nothing to do with revenge, and everything to do with memory. She would not allow her father's legacy to be rewritten. By silence. Not while she still had breath. But even as silence settled in Windsor's halls, The story didn't end because someone else had been watching from the shadows all along. Months before her passing, Queen Elizabeth penned a private note meant only for Anne. Locked in her writing desk, it was found just days after the confrontation. And its contents? They shattered everything Anne thought she knew, not just about Philip, but about her mother's role in the entire affair. The letter wasn't formal. It wasn't marked by royal stationery or bound by protocol. It was handwritten, personal, and heartbreakingly human. It was discovered by a trusted confidant while organizing Elizabeth's private effects, sealed in an envelope, labelled only with Anne's name and the words, "For when the silence becomes too loud." In the note, the Queen confessed what Anne had never imagined. She had been the one to first suggest Louis. Elizabeth admitted that in her final years, she grew increasingly concerned with the fragility of the institution, its waning public favour, and the generational disconnect. She urged Philip to consider the long game, to build something that would outlast them all. "He listened more than you'll ever know," she wrote, "and I carry the weight of that silence." But it wasn't just strategy. Elizabeth revealed a deeper truth, a guilt that had haunted her for decades. She had seen Anne's devotion, she had relied on it, and yet she had failed to protect it when it mattered most. "You were never invisible to me," the Queen wrote. "You were my mirror, my strength, my shelter from the storm. But I let tradition speak louder than love. I am sorry." That single line collapsed the wall Anne had spent years building. It didn't erase the pain, it didn't rewrite Philip's will, but it did something even more unexpected. It gave Anne clarity, a truth too late, perhaps, but no less powerful. The decision to pass everything to Louis hadn't been a betrayal by one parent, it had been a burden carried by both, in silence, in fear, and in love twisted by duty. And within that final letter came the most shocking revelation of all. Elizabeth had begun orchestrating a royal realignment long before her death. Quiet, calculated shifts meant to bypass old expectations, to shape the monarchy for a world she knew was coming. Louis was not the end of Anne's legacy. He was the beginning of a new one built, ironically, on the values Anne had lived by all her life. Not entitlement, but endurance. Not titles, but truth. Anne didn't cry when she finished reading the letter. She didn't speak, but something inside her settled, not with forgiveness but with understanding. In the end, she had been seen, and sometimes that was enough. And so, with legacy shattered and reshaped, the royal family moves forward fractured, but still bound by the silence of history and the echoes of a decision that changed everything. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.